Good evening and welcome to our event commemorating Black History Month. Since apartheid in South Africa, how far have we come? And it's great to start off with my favorite South African singer, Miriam Makeba, more particularly Pata Pata. I could feel the sunshine of South Africa on my back as I'm listening to that. This side event is a tale of two cities and two worlds. We will examine how far have we progressed since apartheid in South Africa. We will engage in a virtual discussion from a personal, international, and religious perspective. It now gives me great pleasure to hand across to my sister from South Africa, Palesa. Palesa, the virtual floor is yours. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Just nod. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm really, really glad to be here and spend this evening with you to talk about South Africa, how far we have traveled since the end of apartheid. Just by way of background, so I am young enough to have not experienced the full might of the apartheid system, but young enough to have seen the end of the apartheid system, or old enough to have seen the end of apartheid system. So I came of age when the apartheid government was in decline and under a lot of pressure. There was internal revolt against the state. It was a state under international isolation, and yet its last years of rule were quite brutal. I came from a family that was pretty much part of that struggle against that system. and personally have lost a sibling to the underhands of the activities of that regime. But at the same time, I'm also old enough to have been a beneficiary of major changes that unfolded in South Africa over the past 26 years. Through very deliberate policies of a post-apartheid government, we saw a huge explosion of the Black middle class, such that it is possible to speak today of a new multiracial middle class, that through travel, that through new media connectivity has truly become part of a transnational elite, if you want to call it that. That is in a sense at the heart really of what we can call progress in South Africa since the end of apartheid. But to fully really understand the significance of where South Africa is at today, it is important to recall some of the milestones achieved or have overcome to actually have the appreciation of how far the country has traveled over the past 26 years. First of all, we need to understand that the struggle against apartheid was truly an internal conflict over who was allowed to sit or who was allowed at the seat of power and whose rights will be protected under the law. As we all know, that South Africa was deemed a crime against humanity by the United Nations. It is because it denied majority of South Africans those basic human rights that many people all over the world had taken for granted. But on the basis of their race, Black people in the land of their birth were denied the most basic of rights by a white settler regime on the basis of their skin color. So the battle against apartheid became a battle to restore those basic rights for all, not just one section, but for everyone who lived in that country under the law. So after an intense period of conflict, the apartheid government was weakened and was brought to a negotiating table. And South Africans themselves said, we will decide what kind of a country we will build or what kind of a country we want for ourselves. And that it would become a homegrown solution negotiated by South Africans themselves. Unlike what happened in Zimbabwe, people went to Lancaster, they went to the UK to negotiate a settlement for the Zimbabweans. But in South Africa, we said it is our problem, it is our conflict, and we will resolve it together and decide what kind of a country we are going to build together. But in the journey to building that nation, that new nation, a few things happened to get to the point where we are today. So two major things that happened that almost derailed that long-term project. One of them, and I was reminded of this when on the 6th of January, it happened here in the nation's capital when people stormed the capital. That it reminded me of South Africa when a section of the right wing in the Afrikaner community also stormed the World Trade Center to stop history unfolding in a sense. That was one thing that happened. And the second thing that was also significant that happened was the killing of the ANC leader, Chris Hani. And I'm sure many of you know of that. And those were very tense moments in that moment towards resolving the South African conflict. That time required quite a very, very decisive and important and very thoughtful leadership around how do you deal with this? I mean, I remember exactly where I was when Chris Hani was killed, very tense, and it was a moment of whether we are going to go ahead with building a new country or we are going to go back. And it took a special leadership of Nelson Mandela, who had the foresight of what the long-term vision, what is the long-term goal, and how to navigate through leadership through very difficult times and be able to carry with you the support of a very deeply divided nation. It has that ability to come a nation at that moment that spoke to not only Madiba and Mandela's talents in leadership, but his moral authority that he brought in leadership, that he was listened to and was able to bring a very divided nation together to say, we have a long-term vision, let's keep going and let's not be derailed by really some serious events that were unfolding at that time. And after Chris Hani was killed, and two things that happened after that, that also, these are the markers of the beginning of building this new nation that we call South Africa. So we had our first elections in 1994. I'm sure all of you remember all those long lines of people in all shapes and sizes and colors who stood in long hours wanting to cast their vote for their new government, their own government. So Nelson Mandela became president in 1994. And between 1994 and 1996, South Africans began to craft the final draft of our constitution, a constitution that many people across the world talks about, that it is a symbol of a negotiated settlement, but also a very transformational document in a true sense of it. And what is the essence of the South African Constitution? Is that South Africa will be a united, a democratic, a non-racial, and non-sexist state in which sovereign authority is exercised over all its territory. Number two, that the Constitution will be the supreme law of the land, and that it will be guarded over by an independent, non-racial, and impartial judiciary. And I think that's important to remember, because you had a situation in South Africa where the vast majority of people were denied rights. They had no rights under any law. And then you craft a constitution that says everybody belongs in South Africa, regardless of where you come from, regardless of race, that we are all South Africans, a united nation, in a sense. And I think the major highlight of and strength of the new South Africa is how South Africans made our constitution a living document. And I think you will all recall that in the middle of the 1990s and in the early 2000s, that South Africa had a deadly virus similar to what we're experiencing, the world is experiencing today. The deadly virus of HIV and AIDS. And our new government at that time, for various reasons, refused to give antiretroviral drugs to the people who were suffering from HIV and AIDS. And it took South Africans and civil society organizations taking its own government to court to say, you will give South Africans the right to healthcare, you will give them drugs, the antiretroviral drugs. And I think understanding that is that, you've got the political rights that are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights in South Africa, but you also have the socioeconomic rights. And that was a test to whether the socioeconomic rights can be guaranteed, that are guaranteed by the Constitution, can actually be realized, and forcing the government to realize those rights. The Constitutional Court ruled in 2002 in favor of civil society organizations that the government will give drugs to people who are suffering from HIV and AIDS. And the government at that time, under President Thabo Mbeki, agreed to abide by the ruling of the court and started rolling out the antiretroviral drugs, making South Africa the leading country to provide those drugs to people living with HIV and AIDS across the world. But now you come back recently, and I'm sure you've all been following what's happening in South Africa, that governance has become quite a challenging thing in South Africa today, with massive corruption and the weakening of the democratic state. As a result, there has been almost an unhealthy reliance on the bench and the judiciary to rescue South Africa's democratic project. I'm sure you will recall that over the past few years, there's been a massive scandal happened over 3 years ago with the former president, Jacob Zuma, who used public funds to build himself a massive compound in his rural homestead of Nkandla. And there was a massive outcry, huge massive outcry, and our public protector ruled against him, and it was all taken to the Constitutional Court. And the ruling by the public protector was also confirmed by our constitutional court. But now what you're having as well currently is that the judiciary is overseeing an investigation of massive corruption. You know, the Deputy Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, has been chairing a commission of inquiry investigating what we term in South Africa state capture. What that means is that you have politicians that have given control of public administration really to private interest in return for massive kickbacks. It is a situation where private individuals influence who gets appointed to positions of authority within the state, and making sure that those individuals report to them and not to the public authority of the state. But now what is the difficulty with this situation is that it brings the judiciary into the realm of politics. And it remains to be seen how damaging this will be to the independence of the judiciary in the long term. It is not an ideal situation to have the bench step in where politics is failing. And I think it is going to become a major challenge to the long-term health of the South African democratic project. But having said that, South Africa remains a very noisy, very loud, very energetic democracy. The freedom of the press is sacrosanct. Anyone, anybody can criticize the president of the country. Anybody can criticize the Chief Justice. Anybody can say anything without any fear whatsoever. So that is a very healthy place to be in, especially in the continent where we all come from, that you can really say anything without any fear that you will be jailed, that anything will happen to you. It's very healthy to live in a country like that. And I'm saying that despite the challenges of inequality and poverty and deep divisions around race and class, and we're seeing that also here in the United States, there remains a resilient belief that South Africans will finally and will always resolve their problems together. We may not have today the wisdom of Mandela's leadership, but I think South Africans, we all know very well that we have the legacy of Mandela's leadership that we can always draw from. So with that, I'd really like to say that it's been 26 years, very challenging, but it remains a country with very, very, with ability, it is a country that we should never give up on, despite all the problems that we're experiencing. Thank you, Gotsi.
Thank you very much, my sister. It now gives me great pleasure to hang across to Professor Asha. Thank you so much, Professor. I know you have a very tight schedule. If I can wish you Shag Perom Samak, also to Kenneth and Sami. The virtual floor is yours, Professor. Could you unmute yourself?
Thank you, Dr. Izzy. I appreciate the deference for the holiday, Hag Samer, Hag Purim Samer, as you wrote very well. And also the fact that you led off with Miriam Makeba. I had the pleasure of hearing her in the in Greenwich Village in the old days, many decades ago, when I was young, handsome, and single, and very much in demand. I would go there, the Finjan, and hear the beat singers. I don't know what I was doing because I was always a straight arrow, but it was nice to imbibe that kind of music, and I'm delighted to have heard her again. I also recall earlier in a different broadcast or webinar that I mentioned that I participated in a demonstration against apartheid in the 60s with James Farmer and other civil rights leaders was it Fifth Avenue, the South African consulate. I remember circling around and demanding the end of apartheid. So Little did we know then that it would take another 2 decades before the dismantling of that horrible system, which is the equivalent of Jim Crow in the United States, or was. Also, to go along with Valesa's obvious observation that South Africa is a verdant land rich in many resources, most of all human resources. It's unbelievable. It could be the leader of the continent, along with Nigeria, were it not its divisions, which I will lead to. South Africa was destined to become a bastion of unremitting racism in the 20th century as the Western powers scrambled for colonies and to also indicate their white supremacy. South Africa was incorporated in 1913 and with the triumph of the British over the Dutch in the Boer Wars. Can you imagine that the minority would put the majority in reservations, and they would deny them the right to menial labor, to sharecroppers, for example. It's just inconceivable today, but that's what it was. Keep in mind that the early part of the 20th century saw the apogee of Western imperialism and militarism. Both were given the blessing of the faith of Christianity because it was, in Rudyard Kipling's phrase, infamous phrase, it was the white man's burden. It was to uplift the masses, the terrible, terrible, arguably, even the man who has been dubbed the man of the century. Who is that? Sir Winston Churchill. He had his own heavy burden to read of white supremacy and racism even. He was not reticent to promote European superiority and think less of the swaths of humanity in Africa and South Asia, including the people living in the British crown jewel of India. Our own president, just to compare, our own president, Theodore Roosevelt, didn't resist the waves of white superiority, obviously viewing our native Indians and Blacks as lagging, if not always menacing. In 1940, a statue was erected to the 26th president in front of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City's Central Park West, in an evolution of what passes today as unacceptable anachronistic standard. It depicts Teddy, yes, a lovable Teddy, Theodore Roosevelt, mounted on his horse, flanked by a semi-naked African and an American Indian. Let us remember another dimension of world history. Charles Darwin, he was a fabulous scientist in the evolution of botanical species, but there were charlatans and unethical individuals who fashioned social Darwinism that would include future eugenics, the actual scientific development of races. From this narrow, dominant perspective, indigenous South Africans were seen part of a primitive mass of people, subject races, never to be considered for self-rule, always to be made aware that Europeans were so selfless to give of themselves, to be the task of uplifting the gaze of their charges. Still, it's not surprising that resistance was being galvanized in South Africa by their own people, by their own local talent early on, creating the powerhouse that is today the African National Congress. The Great Depression, along with the outcome of World War II, Ironically, the two super empires, the British and the French, actually became weakened as a result of World War II. That's why the United States picked up the burden of British colonization. Um, as a result of that, the whites of South Africa organized into the Afrikaner National Party. We trace the enshrining of comprehensive legal racial segregation to the inception of this notion of apartheid. The partners that would keep Black tribal minorities from each other. They cultivated the divisions among the tribes together from the increasingly isolated whites. Such systemic racism requires manufacturing categories of people to regulate all interactions, typical of totalitarian states, not incipient democracies. Even one nominally pretending to be upholding Western values. The aim was always to prevent the mobilization of opposition to white minority rule by majority Blacks. Mentioning 10, uh, um, 10 South African tribes in alphabetical order easily illustrates their intertribal rivalries at work, as well as the relatively ease the whites had in dividing and conquering. The Nebali, the Pedi, the Pondo, the Sotho, the Swati, the Tonga, the Tuwana, the Venda, the Hota, and the Zulus. Most famous, of course, because of later power struggle. In the United States, the relatively ease of categorization, Blacks and whites, gave way to the contemporary phenomenon by teenage Puerto Rican friend of mine. When we came to America, I met this fellow who marveled as he exclaimed once. He took me to his house and he showed me a photograph of all his family in the 1950s. This was in the mid 50s. And there, on the occasion that was celebrated, were relatives of a variety of hues, from whites to mulattoes to Blacks, and different shades of Black or different shades of white, either way. Imagine having to navigate the internal identification required to declare oneself belonging to the Bantus, that was the Black Africans, to South Asians, that's Indians and Pakistanis, and the so-called colored, the representing mixed race. Administering such regulations became a bureaucratic nightmare, imbued with inconsistencies, arbitrariness, and always accompanied by unspeakable pain. The Cold War was prosecuted between 1945 and 1989, uh, uh, gave us a kind of a pass for South Africa to do its evil doings because they were on our side. That is, somehow that excused their brutality. Um, Wrongly doctrinaire, we had the Soviet menace to consider. Again, the mistake of history was that to look at communism as monolithic, that there was no difference between Chinese, Vietnamese, and Russian communism. We had to oppose them. The United States saw, even in the reactionaries abroad, like Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, Pinochet in Chile, and the colonels in my own land of Greece, as being pro-West. not necessarily democratic, but at least they were not communist. From such prism, South Africa was able to play the West in common parlance, avoiding direct criticism for its numerous unremitting human rights violations, while toeing to the North Americans, voting with them in the United Nations and denouncing the domestic opposition to white rule. A trio of events that stands out for their cruelty. In 1960, we had the Sharpeville massacre, the long-term jailing for 27 years of Nelson Mandela for insisting for his political agitation, and the brutal suppression of the Soweto uprising in 1976. I remember those things like they happened yesterday. Western civilization promised to offer the virtues of literacy, medicine, training in self-government, tolerance, minimization of, if not eradication of bigotry. Frequently, the West was recognized and further cultivated self-aggrandizement, exploitation of native division, civil strife, we know regional military conflict, rise of authoritarian regimes, impoverishment, hunger, famine, general underdevelopment, and the legacy of intertribal rancor. In the instance of South Africa, the country was liberated to seek its destiny from human resources within to go along with incalculable mineral wealth. The convergence of the end of the Soviet Union, the seeming rise of democratic expectations, the impact of crippling sanctions against the apartheid conspired to bring about the end of a shameful chapter in the continent's southern tip. However, the transition to universal franchise and shared leadership, even with a grudging endorsement of whites, could not have been so successful without the visionary endorsement of whites, including F.E. de Klerk and, of course, the great Nelson Mandela, both of whom would eventually share in the 1993 Nobel Prize for Peace. Justice delayed is surely justice denied. However, a semblance of restoration, decency, and appreciation of the depth of depravity from which South Africa continues to ascend was the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In exhaustive testimonies, perpetrators and victims confronted apartheid's tragic legacy, and some restorative justice came about. A permanent institute for justice and reconciliation was established in the year 2000. Such approaches can be usefully adopted by other countries: China, Greece, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Malaysia, Myanmar, North Korea, Syria, Saudi. The list seems to be endless, including the United States of America. Meanwhile, how satisfying that Black Lives Matter has also returned to claim its paramount role in the land that predated European nation states, where indeed our human species began, and that's in South Africa. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a lengthy history of South Africa. Other countries played a very important role in dismantling apartheid, more particularly in Nigeria. Nigeria and the African continent was at the forefront, and the important role also that Nigerian women played. It gives me great pleasure now to turn across to my sister, Attorney Neoma Albert Benson. Attorney Benson, the floor is yours.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes, is a very interesting topic, and Nigeria, and especially Nigerian women, are very much they like to be their sister's keeper. I would say that. So I know that following the story and the history of apartheid and how Nigerian women rallied and, raised awareness all over the country. It was something that I can very much recall, that there were women groups everywhere. Nigerian women have a way of rallying themselves together, especially through the market women. And Nigerian women are always in the market. So the market women are a very strong strategy group in Nigeria. And Nigerian women at the time rallied a lot of, I would say, strategy groups of market women trying to build a lot of awareness on what was happening in South Africa, and taking it all the way to the United Nations and to all other African countries, and trying to get sister countries involved in trying to, stop the apartheid. The stories were everywhere. The stories were, the market women made sure that the stories got into every family, and which was what it was, because they wanted to build that consciousness of what was going on, and to let people know that these were our brothers and these are our own people that are going through this. Because at some point it seemed as if, like Professor said, we thought it was something that was going to end, and then it seemed as if it just kept going on for decades, and people felt like, what is going on? Like, it felt like the whole world had abandoned South Africa, because at some point it just felt like everything that was happening and all of the advocacy that was going on against the apartheid, that it was going to end like tomorrow, but it kept lingering. And this was what infuriated the women, and made them to raise that awareness, especially through the market women, which was the strongest strategy group at the time, and try to lobby policymakers to stand out and go out there and talk to influential people, the UN and everyone, to do something about it. So Nigeria, as I have always known as a Nigerian, have always had a particular interest, and we're very much involved in getting to raise that advocacy in the African Union, especially, and all over Africa, to make sure that the apartheid, and it was actually the women who moved that force. The women were the force behind everything that happened, especially getting the lawmakers to push everything through the African Union and all other countries in Africa. So the women have continued to be a force even after apartheid, because now we're talking about how far we've come after apartheid. The women have continued to be a force, especially with the trappings of what have lingered from apartheid, xenophobia, and everything that has come after apartheid. And this has also affected Nigerians, because we have a lot of Africans from other countries, especially Nigeria, who are also living. Nigerians live everywhere. So, and Nigerians, they make up, the part of the population in South Africa that suffered the xenophobic attacks. And that has also, been part of what we started to talk about. We started to bring to the table to discuss what is the cause of what is happening, especially because we felt that we were supposed to be our brother's keepers and we're supposed to look out for ourselves. And this is the reason why even now the women are trying to look in to know what exactly, because we see that from the way things are going, the xenophobic attacks have been very reoccurring. So it is something that we have continued to look in, and women have started again to raise awareness and advocacy and started to move in again to be able to know the psychological effects and impact of apartheid that have rolled in to caustic and xenophobic attacks against ourselves. So a lot has happened, and the women have continued to be a strong force in trying to create that unity amongst us and ourselves. And this is what we are continuing to do, especially in Africa, the African Union, and in the United Nations, and for ourselves as Africans.
Thank you very much, Attorney Albert Benson. Thank you so much. I'd just like to point out that racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and related intolerance should be condemned, and I condemned it to the highest. A personal experience of mine, I'd like to say, I became aware of apartheid as a very young girl when I was at school. I should plug my school, the City of London Freeman School in 1976 to 78. I remember being invited by a dear old friend of mine, Elizabeth Bucknell, to her house one evening in Ashted in Surrey. And I was surprised when I walked into the house that the room was filled with white South Africans. And they spoke to us, and to me in particular, about the horrors of apartheid. It left an enduring mark on me, first of all, to go into a house in a country village in in Ashton in Surrey, and to suddenly meet white South Africans, because at that age, automatically, you think South Africa is just Black South African. I wasn't politically savvy at that tender age. It always left an enduring mark on me to see white South Africans who were in London. Obviously, they were in exile, and they were basically having a campaign, having a very active movement to combat apartheid. It gives me great pleasure now to hand across to Dr. Paul de Vries to give us a religious perspective of apartheid and related intolerance. I know that we are all supposed to, as the book of Leviticus tells us, to love our neighbors, love the stranger, as we were all once strangers in Egypt. Professor, the virtual floor is yours.
Forgive me if I leave during the talk. Again, I appreciate
okay, that should be fine.
Your company. It's nothing personal.
Thank you, Asher. Thank you, Asher, and a blessed Purim to you. A day that we can remember, especially just a second, my phone's making some noise. A day that we recognize how hateful hatred can be when we think of the story of Esther as a fresh reminder every year when we reread it at Purim, a very important fresh reminder of how totally broken and demonic human behavior can be. So we rejoice that the Lord and the good people won in that case, and we pray for more such wins, definitely. You know, I appreciate the fact that Dr. Gucci mentioned the spiritual side, which I think I'm always oriented to. The battles are so complex that we always need God's help, and we can see God's help very measurably time and time again as well. As a child growing up in America, I grew up surrounded by a lot of very racist white people that you tried to excuse their racism in a variety of ways. In communities where it was a majority white, that sometimes the just awful excuse for oppressing our Black neighbors was, hey, we're the majority, and democracy is based on what majority wants. And that's just not true. Democracy should be based on what people are guided by God to do, and to do things in decency and tolerance, and hey, loving all our neighbors regardless of their background. And I'm shocked many times when I teach people about loving all your neighbors. It's like a new experience, a new thought, even though they've read the principles of scripture over and over again, to love your neighbor as yourself. And in the story that Jesus gives to explain that simple principle, it's an interracial story where a Jew is beat up and robbed and left for dead, and a Samaritan comes by as the only one that has the compassion. So it's that itself is a radical interracial story. Back in the 1980s, to give a little ancient history here, I became very concerned about South Africa. The more I read about the forces that were ready to kill each other, it just sounded like there would be a huge bloodbath sometime, and perhaps at any point. And I had a friend who had also graduated in graduate school from University of Virginia, and I caught up with him one day, and he worked in the South African office of the CIA, and had a lot of inside information of how much a tinderbox South Africa could be, and how much blood could be spilled if there was a total breakdown of society and people started just going crazy, killing one another in a civil war. And his interpretation, based on his CIA investigations in South Africa, his interpretation was it would be one of the bloodiest civil wars in all of history. So he and I prayed for South Africa. I continued to pray very actively, very intentionally for South Africa, and especially for Mandela, who was a giant, a man of such potential, at least potential great leadership, though we hadn't seen his face in decades. People really didn't know what he looked like. There were various versions of drawings. And when the Tiananmen Square events happened in June of 1989, I was just glued to the radio and to the TV. I have a deep love for all people, including our Chinese brothers and sisters. And we were all of us that love all people were deeply crushed when Deng Xiaoping, sent the army in to slaughter thousands of these brilliant, articulate students that wanted democracy, wanted human rights. Even built a kind of paper mache, huge paper mache look-alike of the Statue of Liberty. They called it the Statue of Democracy, but liberty and democracy go together. And then, I got invitations to help with some research project in Russia because of the great changes, and that awakened me more. I had years before gone behind the Berlin Wall under that oppression, and had secretly ministered to people in East Berlin, in that horrible dictatorship, very oppressive, anti-democratic dictatorship. At any rate, the South African situation kept staying in our minds. And I met with some people to say, let's have a citywide prayer meeting in New York City for Nelson Mandela and for South Africa, because this time period, there's so much liberation going on in Eastern Europe and several countries of Eastern Europe, changes in Russia, hey, that these changes have to go to South Africa where the situation is so dreadful. And so we set a date in September. We set a date to bring as many people together as we could for a prayer meeting on February 9 in 1990. February 9 was our date. Probably because so many other dates, there were so many other things going on. And even the fact that we had announced a special day of prayer in New York City, and we announced that representatives of the ANC, African National Congress, would come to give us more direct, immediate, latest background. But otherwise, we weren't going to have any talk from me or anyone else. It was truly going to be a day of prayer. But the African National Congress came, and they were to be ready, and it did an excellent job giving us background. Little did we know how things were happening behind the scenes, even before our prayer meeting. You know, the Lord answers prayer sometimes before the prayer meeting. And so the rumor was out about 2 weeks before the prayer meeting that Nelson Mandela might be released soon, and no dates suggested. And then Monday, the 6th of February, the announcement was maybe by the end of the week. And so we got all fired up. Let's really have a good turnout for a prayer meeting, and you make a point before the Lord, make a point to one another. And we had an excellent turnout at the prayer meeting. And it was already then, the rumor was by Saturday morning, he would be released. And it was Saturday morning, February 11. I remember it like it was yesterday. And my heart just sang the beautiful picture of him walking out of the prison hand in hand with his wife, and announcing his commitment to peace and to reform, his beautiful devotion to the core issues of toleration and democracy and social justice. I thought, man, vote for him for president of the United States. We could then and now we could use people with such passion. Even back when he began his prison term way back in, was it 64? He made a speech at the end of his trial that it was his firm belief that all people can live in harmony. And when you think of how broken South Africa was when he said that, I mean, what a powerful vision that God had given to him to have a bold statement that we can live in harmony. There can be equal opportunity. We must work for that. This is what I live for, he said, and I am willing to die for it. And I thought, wow. Now he's out of prison. De Klerk has pretty much said apartheid is over. We have to figure out how to dismantle it in the most fair and least violent way. And that itself was a miracle. And the fact that none of that bloodletting, that none of that bloody civil war, worst ever in human history, none of that happened. You got to believe in miracles when we know the data, we know what was possible, we know what was even probable, and none of that happened. It was a peaceful transition with amazing grace. I'm intrigued always by who influences the thinking of people. And Mandela was deeply influenced by Nehru in terms of the need for radical social change, and both South Africa and India had been part of the British Empire and had common oppressor. Gandhi also, especially in terms of his nonviolence. Now, Mandela did organize a kind of type of guerrilla group to fight against the abuse. And the Spear of the Nation was, I believe, the name of the group. But those years and years and years in prison, he shifted so completely to be totally for peaceful transition, with the power of the law, with the power of good politics. Of course, you still have to keep people in line, but a peaceful transition, nevertheless. And he pulled it off in such a dramatic way. He was drawn sometimes to Marxism, and who wasn't? I mean, the promise of socialism is such a beautiful picture, but never works. And I've lived in socialist countries, I can say more if whenever that's desired. But I think the timing was perfect because all these socialist countries were falling apart in the months before he was released. So he was saved from the embarrassment of saying that he was a socialist or whatever and sided with any of these terrible regimes of Eastern Europe or China. They'd all proved themselves either to be just horrifically oppressive or the will of the people won to achieve liberty. And of course, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and his life and legacy was a powerful influence for Mandela too. And that again, being a nonviolent legacy that is pro equal opportunity, pro social justice, which are my passions, and I assume probably passions of all of us on this call. So I do think a nagging question is, where is their apartheid today? And I suggest, Dr. Gucci, we bring that up before we close out today. I have a couple of ideas.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Paul. I'm sure you do. I'd just like to say that my journey being aware of apartheid, as I said, started when I was about 16 or 17 when I was at boarding school in England. And that's when I became aware of Nelson Mandela, as I said earlier on. And the journey actually continued till when he was released. But the day he was released, I wasn't actually in England. I was in northern Nigeria, in Katsina State. And I remember going to visit a friend of mine, Husseina Ladambaki. She was the wife of the former ambassador of Nigeria to the Netherlands, who had recently died, and I was spending some time with her. And I remember going into her house that day, and she said to me, "I've got some good news for you." And I was wondering, what good news can we have? You're in the middle of northern Nigeria, and it can be quite unstable there. Then she said, sit down. And she turned the telly on. And I always remember seeing Nelson Mandela coming out of prison with holding his wife's hand, Winnie. And to me, it was surreal because it's, I said to her, "Is that real?" And she said, "Yes." And I thought to myself, wow, that I remember thinking, that God is in control. And I remember particularly around that time, many countries were falling. You had the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I remember being in England when the Soviet Union fell. So it really begs the question, what exactly was going on at that particular point in time globally, that most of these repressive countries, their walls are virtually falling down. I'd like to throw a question in first before we come on to apartheid, a way to exist today. Basically, what drove Nelson Mandela to forgive? I mean, it can be difficult when your enemy treats you so badly. What was in Nelson Mandela that he was able to forgive? I remember meeting him in London when he came to London after his release, and I remember thinking, you know, his power, his ability to forgive those who had oppressed him. I know we're told to love thy neighbor and to forgive those who persecute, those who persecuted us, we're to forgive them. And it's basically a question which I can throw in for three of you. What did you think? What quality did he have in him that he was able to forgive? What do you think, my sister Palesa?
Yeah, Ugochi, that's a very interesting question. And I think it's a question that many of us ponder a lot around leadership and drawn to the leadership of Nelson Mandela. I mean, I think it comes through in his writings, it comes through in his long walk to freedom. And part of it is the time that he spent in prison and really trying to understand the other side, where they were coming from. What was apartheid? What is racism really, more than anything else? Over and above naked power, it really is about fear of the other. That you are scared of the other people, that you fear of what you don't know, and thinking that if you open up and embrace what you don't know, it's going to dilute who you are, or it's going to take your sense of self away. And I think Nelson Mandela spent quite a lot of his time in prison just trying to understand what was driving the other side. And once he realized that with what's driving them is fear of living in South Africa as a minority race in the bottom of a continent, and what they have done to the continent, to that particular country, if they take over, what will they do to us? What punishment will be meted out? And I think after he was able to understand that fear was that actually this, and I think that is the strength of South Africa, and that's the legacy of Nelson Mandela in South Africa, is that when we say South Africa belongs to all who live in it, I think South Africans really, truly, fully understand and appreciate what that means. It is not a country for one race, because the other race said it is our country and everyone else doesn't have rights. But Nelson Mandela was able to say, no, everyone who lives in this country belongs in this country, and we are going to find a way that we are going to be able to build a one united democratic nation. And I think the concept of non-racism, it is such an important concept for South Africa to teach the world. I mean, we're not talking about multiracial. We're saying it's a non-racist, and it's a dream, it's a vision to build a non-racial society. And when we're talking about a non-racial society, we are saying that even though we understand that race is a social construct, but it doesn't really define who we are. It defines our history of division, but our vision is to build a country where race does not really matter at all. And I think Nelson Mandela understood that very, very well. And it is the legacy that he left for South Africa to go forward. So it is a very long answer to your question around what is forgiveness, why was he able to forgive his, and I think it's really understanding the fear from the other side and transcending that and saying that we can all together build a country for our future. And I think that's the power of Mandela's teachings, really.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me just put a question to you, but go an overview first, and anybody can jump in and take it. Right, the summer of 2020 in the United States was a summer we've never seen before. In addition to the ongoing COVID global pandemic, there was a pandemic of hate, social and racial injustice. A global pandemic of indifference. Now, why did these demonstrations emerge at this particular point in time in the United States? Were they a cause of or a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic? Or was it a cause of the deep-rooted injustices in the United States? Now, how far can we say that apartheid exists in the United States? Anybody can take that question? I believe you're leading in that direction, Professor Paul.
Yes. Well, I think apartheid is an evil plan that South Africans did not have a copyright on,
Monopoly, yes.
or patent or whatever, trademark. It's something that's very evil to divide people up. I went to a integrated high school. About half of the students were Black and half white. But during lunch period, the weird thing was people would divide off. There were whole tables that were white, whole tables that were Black. And I personally most often ended up on the Black table because I wanted to expand my consciousness and understand more and more about a community that mattered, that I had, prior to high school, had not had much exposure to. So, but there is this mentality of building walls, and my mission in life is to tear them down. So to really build relationships. However, I was a teacher in a high school right after it was integrated in the South. And the amazing evil of the administration in the way it manipulated and hurt the Black teachers and the Black students was just unspeakable. You don't have the time to hear all of the offenses that I saw and spoke out about. So I was not treated as a friend by the superintendent or the principal, but the students loved me because I said what most of the white and Black kids believed, but it was the adults that were all screwed up, the adults that were much more racist in their attitudes. And so at any rate, I think in our own time, there are three huge models of apartheid in American culture that is a part of the tension that exploded with these demonstrations last summer, and we've got a long ways to go. And one is our broken education system, and become more broken under COVID now, because in white communities, the parents can pay some tuition, or in Black communities where there are people with lots of money too, that's happening with private schools or charter schools. But the New York public school system is mostly closed. And the heart for the children, yet the very idea that the children ought to be the focus of education, and and they're not carrying the disease. It's not a problem so the public school system has become even more biased in these last 12 months because of COVID and the foolish, shallow excuses of teachers not to teach the children. Is hugely broken. And in New York City, the children in Black and brown communities are barely less than 20% are on grade level or better. Less than 20% are on grade level, while in Asian or European American communities, percentages are in the 50s or 60s. The same school system, same textbooks, same superintendent of schools, same board of education, and the difference is just night and day. And partly because the schools are effectively segregated, neighborhood schools, and the parents are not given a right to choose. To me, that would change everything. If parents had the right to choose the schools for their children, then the system would shape up, because the schools are so poorly run that are in the Black and brown communities would have no students. And that would be a wake-up call to the administration to get its act together. But it's grossly unfair to the children. I applied to be a math teacher at a high school in the Bronx years ago, 25, more than 25 years ago. And I was in the top of the list. I was close to being hired, but principals told me when I visited the schools, Mr. DeVries, we just have to tell you, there's not much education that happens here. The teachers are usually just happy to get home safe because there's just no discipline, no commitment to education. And I said to the principal, well, what can you do to fix this? And it was just like, that's just the way it is. So anyway, the school system and the colleges too, the number of Black and brown students that applied to college or accepted in really good schools is way down, in part because of the brokenness of their high schools. But if you don't have a college education, it's very hard to get a great job. And just as under slavery, the slave children were deprived of learning how to read, learning literacy, if we are not teaching the basic language arts and math and science to the children, we are confining them to a life of poverty and dependence. Not pretty. And the third area is mass incarceration, mostly because the schools are broken. Because if you can't read the job application form, you're not going to get the job. And when young people are full of energy but can't get a job, crime becomes a much too big temptation. So in America, the prisons are clearly racially defined, and our high schools and elementary schools, and as a result, our colleges too. And we have to raise holy hell about this and bring true liberty through empowering our children for a better future. I'm so utterly passionate about this. I could talk right till midnight about what I think we can do and what's broken. But nevertheless, you got a little taste of it.
Yeah.
And by the way, thank you, all the other panelists. This has been a fascinating, absolutely inspiring discussion of these core issues, how much it matters that we have freedom, social justice, and a non-racial definition of what our societies are about. That would be a beautiful world. I hope we don't have to wait till the New Jerusalem comes.
I hope so.
Make a lot better progress than we're making
I
now.
hope so, Professor, as well. Yeah, the COVID pandemic has shown the vast differences in the system in neighborhoods. For example, also in the United Kingdom, the Black, Asian, and minority community have suffered disproportionately, which is we have a similar scenario in the United States. Now, how far do you believe that negative political rhetoric has played a role to fuel the politics, what I call the politics of indifference? Who would like to take that question?
I could just have a quick response. Look at the Bronx. There was no distribution of the vaccine in the Bronx until last week. Now, how is that fair? Yeah. And the Bronx is more Black and brown than any of the boroughs of New York City. And to have nothing for Black and brown people, all the while the governor is saying, we're putting priority for Black and brown people, but he's just giving a damn lie. If I could use a little Hebrew there, he's just giving a damn lie. It's not. He's been biased toward white and other communities, but definitely not the Black and brown community, and not the poorest of all the boroughs, the Bronx.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what I've seen in the United States with regard to COVID-19 and when the pandemic really started, and the world has seen about the United States is the real underbelly of this country that became very visible to the entire world. That there is the United States that the world is used to seeing, politicians from the US presenting themselves at the UN or presenting themselves at Davos, because being that spokesperson of the global elite in elite forums, and the United States that you see on Hollywood and so on. But when this came up, and you're like, wow, there is the third world in the United States. It's two nations, two worlds, like the first world and the third world coexisting in the United States. And that became very clear. And I think it basically shattered all that veneer of the United States as, the developed world. It is, I mean, it's a very rich country, it's the richest country in the world, but it's the richest country in the world that is not able to take care of its most vulnerable citizens. I mean, it's like living in South Africa or living in India. When you see what you saw in Texas over last weekend, for example, the long lines of people who did not have access to water, who didn't have access to electricity. Most of those people were Black and brown people. How is that possible in the richest world, in the richest country in the world? I mean, those are the serious questions that not only are Americans asking of themselves, but the world is asking of the United States. What is it? How is it possible that you can have a country that's so rich and is not able to take care of its most vulnerable citizens?
Yeah, but that was similar. That was very similar to what happened under Hurricane Katrina, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I still have visions of seeing people of color, Black people, stranded on roofs, and there was nobody to rescue them. I mean, what exactly went wrong there?
Yeah.
Sorry, Attorney Albert Benson, I believe you'd like to say something. Sorry about
yes,
that.
I just wanted to buttress what we're saying, because I can say that I had a personal experience, because I recently told my primary care doctor last week that I think that I received better medical care in Nigeria, which is supposed to be like a developing country, than I received in the US recently, because it just seemed as if all of the pandemic and all of the politics and everything kind of brought out the worst in the country. Or maybe would I say it exposed a lot in the country that hitherto we didn't know, or probably swept under the carpet, or things that seemed like they were systemic in the past were now blatantly being done in the open, and a lot of things were exposed. And I was afraid for myself, for the healthcare that I was getting in the hospital. I was afraid for myself. It was so open. There was so much hatred, and it just seemed as if so many things just came out to the surface. And it's just been probably things that we had swept in the carpet, under the carpet in the past. Like we said, is the US had always been a model, like a role model to everyone. Thinks, oh, this is where everything is right, this is where politics is done better, or people rule better. But everything kind of just seemed in just the space of a few months, and there was so much expose to, a lot of things that have shown that it was actually being deep rooted, and it's not something that just started to happen. It's just that it's something that is being exposed. So really sad.
And that is the test of justice. How are the people in the social structure that are the least, how are they treated, is the definition of the question of justice for any society, as all the Hebrew prophets said, and as even Adam Smith said, economies have to be judged by how they treat the poorest, the weakest. And he proposed it within a free market, there has to be the safety nets, and we have to be giving attention there first and regulating the banks to be sure that they are fair and how they're giving loans. So, you know, the whole idea of redlining for Adam Smith back over 200 years ago was just absolutely horrible offense to any good economics. So the abuse of, the neglect of the least, and who's more the least than the children in impoverished neighborhoods getting no education at all, getting nothing over these last 12 months. Because they didn't have a computer at home. They can't do virtual learning. And the city said, oh, we'll supply the computers. Guess what? The computers didn't get delivered. Little mistake here. And it's like, oh, a little mistake. We'll work on this. As if this was small mistake. No, this was huge. For children to lose a whole year means they've lost 2 years because they've gone backwards in the last year without their practice in arithmetic or reading. So it's a lot worse than it seems at first.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, Ken Abramovich, would you like to say something? Would you like to contribute? Hello? I don't think he's there.
Kenny's gone.
Sami, would you like to say something? No, I don't think so. Hi, Professor, you're back.
I'm back. I'm actually a block away from the house. I was able to hear the Megillah and have you in mind. So I am joining halfway now, or towards the end. I can say that the inequality, the disparity has grown for the developed world and the undeveloped world. South Africa was to be the beacon of hope, and crime rates, black, black, as well as the fear of whites. I mean, those gated communities is really an anathema. This is not the way to live, but I don't know how long it will be before there is some kind of equilibrium between the dominant races. You know.
Yeah.
Sammy, it's good to see you.
Hi, Sammy. Would you like to say something?
Yes, I would like to say.
Yes, hello.
As a Holocaust survivor, when I talk to the young people, first of all, I give them the history, because basically things did not happen suddenly. Everything starts with words. It starts with pamphlets, documentaries. And it starts with, which leads to discrimination, violence, riots, and all of these things. And the point that I'm trying to make is that what we have to do is we have to react immediately when we see the slightest injustice. And many times by being silent, we are actually part of the problem. We have gone through a very difficult period of time, we still go through, I don't know for how long, with COVID-19. However, there is another virus which is much more dangerous. And that is the virus of bigotry, of bullying. You can bully a person, you can bully a group of people. You have anti-Semitism, hatred. They're two separate things, they're not the same. And ideology. Those things cannot be eradicated. They will always be there. They will take different forms, depends on the technology that they have and the ability to communicate. The only way that this can be combated is only through education. And we have to start to educate the young people, okay, not at the university level, not at the, when they are going to graduate from high school. I start with fourth graders. Trust me, believe me, they are not too young. And they ask better questions because out of curiosity, okay? They have not been right now indoctrinated with the wrong ideas. And they ask absolutely wonderful questions, many times better
I've
than.
got to.
Last time they gave us something similar with
Sorry.
eyes.
Okay. So basically, okay, what I'm really trying to say is we have to concentrate on education. And unfortunately, I can give you many examples. The education in this country, when it comes about genocide and Holocaust, is very, very dismal. Okay. It's not the proper form, but if you want to, I can give you very specific examples how bad it is.
Thank you very much, Sami.
My honor, a pleasure.
Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for participating today in this virtual event. More particularly, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Palesa. It's always good to have a personal perspective. We can sit here and have a discussion about apartheid, but I feel it's very important to have somebody actually from the country so they can give us a different perspective and also to break down any views or opinions we may have. I'd like to sort of end with a quote from Amos chapter 5, verse 24, which says, "But let justice run down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." Once again, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everybody. Thank you very much, and be well and be safe. God bless you all. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you,
Much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank
I'm
you.
so delighted to say good evening and good night. Blessings.
And good morning, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you.
Night. Thank you so
We'll
much.
just-
Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, we'll just hear Miriam Makeba will end with
All right.
pata pata.
That's not bad.
And everybody starts to move as soon as Pata Pata starts to play.
Thanks very much. Be well.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.